Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started with the introduction today. So I'll take a moment first to acknowledge the place where I am and where hopefully in the future we might all gather here, which the lands and the waters that are currently occupied by the University of California, Davis, hold the stories of Indigenous people from time immemorial. We acknowledge the ancestral and the present relationships and responsibilities to this place for the Putwin and Miwok peoples, which is now home to many peoples and nations. We ask that you might also take a moment to consider the Indigenous places that you reside on, wherever that may be, and offer gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who stewarded this land and water long before some of us arrived. Thank you. You can also Google whose land to find out whose land you are on, and you can pay any applicable land taxes if such a trust exists where you live. So thank you to you all and welcome to the final event in our Radical Fermentation Dialogue series featuring Aviaja Lyberth Hauptmann in conversation with Jessica Bissett Perea. The webinar series, if you've joined us previously, brings together the coordinators of a transcollege research cluster that is funded by the UC Davis Humanities Institute called Radical and Relational Approaches to Fermentation and Food Sovereignty. And the point of this is to have interdisciplinary dialogues about fermentation science, Indigenous food security and food safety, performance, feminist science studies, and radical and relational approaches to fermentation. The goal for each of these events is just to offer some explanation about our individual research projects and how they might intersect with the cluster topics, and explore new relationships between and amongst our different fields. So we're pleased to welcome all of you as a part of this research community that we're building around the topic. For those unfamiliar, we're going to start with brief introductions from each of the four coordinating members of the cluster. And then we will turn over to Aviaja, who will tell us much more about her work for the primary presentation. And Jessica will offer a response. But in the meantime, please use the Q&A function to enter questions that you have, which we will take at the end of the talk, questions that arise during the context of Aviaja's presentation. And for any of you who are interested in seeing the rest of this series, you can go to our website, which is radicalfermentation.ucdavis.edu. And under resources, you can view previous presentations from the remaining three of us that we've given in the past. So welcome to you all. My name is Stephanie Moroney, and I'm a feminist science and food studies scholar who likes to create collaborative projects on fermentation and mycology. My current research explores ferment and mycelium as methods for making and repairing and caring for knowledges and relations. My son plays the trombone. I've published articles broadly on the sociocultural impact of the human microbiome science, including the topics of queer fermentation praxis and the colonial afterlife of microbiome science and healthism in probiotic dietary culture. I have a Ph.D. in cultural studies, and I administer the Mellon Public Scholars Program here at UC Davis. Next up is Maria.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure that you're here today. So I'm Maria Marco. I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California in Davis. My work centers on food microbiology and understanding how microorganisms can benefit our health through our digestive tract. I specialize in the study of lactic acid bacteria for their roles in food fermentations and as probiotics. My research encompasses genetic, ecological, and microbiome-centric approaches designed to understand the molecular mechanistic basis for microbial interactions in foods and our digestive tracts. Through my research, teaching, and service commitments, I strive to provide practical and inclusive approaches that allow us to relate to and understand microscopic life. Jessica.
Yeah, really do. Jessica Bissett Perea she'ila kilan. Dena ina eshlan shida, kana ana eshlan shida. Kana aknu shagu shagaya kilanda, sheldina rele te ana eshlan shida. Ramaya to shaloni echlena yilamu shagu yeshtuda, Patwin, Ethlena, Puta Toi, Ka, Shagu Yashtuda, Chinanhesh Kishnashnu, Dena Inak Dudilishi. Hi, my name is Jessica Bissett Perea. I'm a Dena'ina musician and scholar, and I'm currently an assistant professor here at University of California, Davis. My primary communities of practice are rooted in Alaska specifically, and the North Pacific and subarctic regions more generally. I am an Indigenous feminist historian and theorist, and I specialize in Indigenous-led and indigeneity-centered methods in arts and humanities research. My interest in radical and relational approaches to food fermentation are in uplifting Indigenous self-determination movements and expanding multisensorial ways of being, knowing, and doing in arts, humanities, and science education. So, and off to Aviaja.
Thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen because I will be introducing myself as part of this presentation. Is it okay now? So I have been looking forward a lot to travel into this world of Inuit fermentation. Something that is untamed and uncontrolled, but also very misunderstood. And the purpose of my talk today is to give a broad overview of Inuit fermentation practice from Greenland, but also to argue why I believe that it's important that to understand these foods, we don't approach them through the natural sciences alone, through microbiology alone, that we need to come together in convergent research as the four of us do to understand these foods properly. And before I introduce myself, I also want to make sure that everyone knows where I am talking about. I will be talking about Greenland, Galaslinunat, as we call it in Greenlandic. Greenland is this massive land area in the Arctic, and Greenland has been for exactly 300 years this year, since 1721, a colony of Denmark. It was colonized by Denmark 300 years ago. But since the 50s, through several steps, Greenland has become a partly self-governing nation within the Danish kingdom. And the population of Greenland, which is a very small population of about 56,000 people, is a majority of indigenous people, the Inuit, and indigenous people of the Arctic. So that's just to make sure that everyone knows where we are talking about. I'm currently located in Copenhagen, Denmark. So this is me. My name is Aviaja Lyberth Hauptmann. I'm a biologist. I have a background in biology and microbiology from the University of Copenhagen, where I did my master's and my bachelor's degrees. And through my studies, I specialized in cold adapted microbes and the utilization of those as biotechnological tools. I was a co-founder of the first Greenlandic biotech company that owned 2 patents on enzymes from cold environments in Greenland. After finishing my studies, I went for a PhD at the Technical University of Denmark, DTU, where I switched from this lab environment to a in front of the computer environment using metagenomics, looking at the genes of microbes to understand microbial communities in Arctic environments such as snow and ice. After finishing my PhD at DTU, I wanted to use these tools that I acquired through my PhD to research something that was a little bit closer to people than snow and ice environments are. So I started a project called the Greenland Diet Revolution project, a postdoc project about the microbiomes of traditional Greenlandic foods. And that's what I've been researching for the past 3-4 years. And today I'm a visiting postdoc at Professor Maria Marco's lab. As I've said before, that's only virtually for now. I'm still in Copenhagen, but hoping to relocate to UC Davis within this year. This is also who I am. I was born and raised in Greenland. I'm Inuit and Danish of descent. And the 2 hunting photographs that you see here are from Anguyartorfik. Anguyartorfik is my family's hunting ground and has been since the 1950s. Members of my family have come back there each year since 1953. And before that, my family went hunting a little bit farther inland. And the heritage that we have for hunting in this area goes back several hundred years. And we go to Aviaja to hunt caribou and muskox and dry meat from caribou and muskox. And the photos are from 1987. This was when I was 1 year old, the first time that I went there. It's my mother and her brother cutting up the muskox on the photograph. And the second photo is of me and my uncle and my cousin. And this was in 2017. And in between in these 30 years, I lived a lot of the time outside of Greenland, in Denmark or in the US or in Tokyo even. But in 2017, I moved back and I brought my research back to Greenland, and that has changed my perspective to research a lot. And that's also what I'm going to be talking about today. I have 2 sons and I'm married. So that's very shortly about me. There's a lot of things that I want to talk about, so I've tried to keep that short. There's one basic thing that everyone needs to know before we talk about specific Inuit ferments, and that's the basic thing that is to know about the Inuit diet in general, that it is animal sourced. So I brought this simple table just to illustrate that. Some of the older nutritional research in Greenland went to Eastern Greenland and Bissett, and Eastern Greenland was colonized a little bit later. So in 1885, the diet in Eastern Greenland was similar to the pre-colonial diet in Greenland. And what the table shows that this diet has 0% carbohydrate energy, so that means no plants at all, and 55% fat energy, 45% protein energy. And those aren't proteins from lentils or beans. Those are sea mammals, mostly seals. So the Greenlandic diet, as the Inuit diet, as a lot of Arctic indigenous diets, is very heavy on animals. That's important to know. And when you talk about an animal source diet, people tend to think that that has to be an indiverse diet, that if you eat mostly animals, you cannot eat a varied diet. But I think just looking into the diversity of ferments that we have or have history, I think that it exemplifies really well how diverse an animal source diet can actually be. So together with a previous Fulbright student at the University of Greenland, Augusta Finsel, we looked into the historical literature to find accounts of fermented foods through history. I'm just going to move because I see myself and not the table. Sorry. So this table just shows the sea mammals that were fermented, and the seal for the Inuit has been the cornerstone of our diet. It is a very important piece in our diet, and that is also well exemplified by the number of ways that a seal can be fermented. So here are some quotes from historical literature. You can ferment a seal with entire carcasses with the balls left in them, or their flesh or entrails, blood, flippers, blubber filled into bags. This is what we call iginna, and you can eat the stomach content as well. And the stomach content, of course, is also fermented. And then within the family of seals, there are different species of seals that you can ferment. You can ferment the hooded seal, the bearded seal, the harp seal, the barbed seal, or the bladder-nosed seal. And then there's also walrus. I brought a photo. No, doesn't want to move here. This is a fermenting walrus flipper that I had the opportunity to experience in northern Greenland. And this is fermented in a big wooden barrel. So this is one of the ferments that we still have in Greenland. And then there are land mammals as well, the reindeer and the hare, where it isn't actually the animal itself that's fermented, but the intestinal content that's eaten that has been fermented by the animal. There are different kinds of shellfish, and among those is this snow fermented cod, which is also part of one of the research projects that I'm doing, where you put layers of snow and layers of cod, and you leave the cod there to ferment. And the farther along the fermentation, the less frozen it becomes. And then there are the birds, of which some are fermented themselves, and for some it's their intestinal content, and again, some it's their eggs. So now I want to dive into talking about some specific ferments, and I've been looking forward to finally show some of these photos about kiviaq. So kiviaq are fermented seabirds, and before I go into how specifically you make a kiviaq, I want to bring you on the same journey that I had going to get to know the Kiviaq. I was living at the time in Inuk. Inuk is quite southern in Greenland on the west coast, and Kiviaq is a northern Greenlandic dish. It's only made in the very far north of Greenland. So I was traveling to Siorapaluk, and Siorapaluk is actually the northernmost permanently populated place on Earth. And it was a long journey, 4 planes and 1 helicopter ride to get there. And on my way, I was giving an interview in the national radio station in Greenland. And when the radio hosts announced that in a second we'll be talking to Aviaja. Aviaja is a microbiologist. She's traveling to Siorapaluk because she's interested in the Kiviaq. There was at least one person in Siorapaluk, a lady, who became very angry. She was angry because this stranger that I am to that place was coming in and going to investigate their foods, potentially telling them how disgusting or potentially dangerous that their foods are. But that isn't really the focus of my research. The focus of my research is to understand how to make a Kiviaq, to understand, hopefully sometime in the future, what role it has played in our diet in the Arctic. In general, what the fermented foods have had for a role in an Arctic animal source diet. So lucky for me, this lady listened to my radio interview where I was talking about wanting to understand how these foods are healthy, not how they're unhealthy. And she decided to bring her family and greet us at the airport when we arrived in Siorapaluk. And eventually they actually showed us how to make the Kiviaq, and that really of understanding something so rare as the Kiviaq. So without further ado, I'm gonna go into the Kiviaq one step at a time. So Kiviaq are fermented seabirds. There are a number of seabirds that can be used to make the Kiviaq, but the most common one is this one. It's the little auk. And the little auk is a little bird. It's very small. It's like the size of my hand. And the little auk arrives in northern Greenland in May. And then it stays there to breed for about 3 months. And this is why it also makes a lot of sense to ferment these birds, because they are very plenty in a short amount of time. So it's a good idea to catch as many as you can and figure out a way to preserve them for the rest of the year. To catch the little auk, you need to use these tools, the nets. In Greenlandic, they're called gelslut. And you take your gelslut and you go to the breeding grounds outside of your town to catch the little auk from the cliffside. And I hope you can imagine the view, but also the noise sitting there is incredible. There are like thousands, maybe even millions of birds there flying in and out of the cliffside. And then you sit there, patiently catch a bird or two or a couple of hundred. And once you've caught all the birds that you want, that you need for your Kiviaq, there are 2 things that you need to do. One thing is that the birds need to cool down. They're warm-blooded, so they have warm body temperature when they are caught, but you need to let them sit until they reach the same temperature as the environment. And then there's another rule that's repeated again and again around fermented foods in Greenland, and that is the sun cannot see the food. So the birds have to be in the shade away from the sun, and also they need to cool down. And then you take out your seal skin. The seal might be a seal that you caught yesterday or today, or it might be one that you caught last year and you kept the skin in the freezer. And you take the seal out of the skin. So there will be a hole in the tail end, a hole where the head was, and a hole where the flippers were, 4 holes in that seal skin. And then you start stuffing in your birds. And then you squeeze out the air as much as you can. And then you stuff in more birds. So the bird here is larger than a little auk, because this is the Kiviaq that we followed was not a little auk Kiviaq. It was with the word, in English it's called guillemot. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that. In Greenlandic it's eppa. So this one was the eppa giviak. So the birds are slightly larger. If you make them with little ox, there can be several hundred birds in one seal skin, depending of course on how large the seal is. But for this giviak, there were 28 eppa inside. And then you sew up the holes very carefully so that you end up with this really tight sewing. And then you stuff in more birds in the remaining holes, squeeze out more air with this figure ready to be put in the ground. And when you put it in the ground, it's not actually a hole in the ground. The dirt in Greenland, or in Sjoapaluk at least, is cliff. So it says my connection is unstable. I hope I come through okay. So the hole isn't very deep. It's more like a lining of rocks. And what you see on the photos here on the left side is a giviak hole that had been used previous years, where you see some leftover seal blubber. And on the right side is the hole that was used for the particular giviak that we followed. And the thing that you see in the bottom, the silver thing, is a temperature data locker. I had a chance to put in a data locker outside of the giviak and a data locker in the center of the giviak as well. And then you cover all the areas that have been sewn with seal blubber. And then you pack it up really snugly and tightly into that hole. And finally, you cover it with rocks. And then you wait and you let the climate and the sun do its thing. The sun heats up the rocks, as they say, and that is part of making the giviak. And then you go out once in a while, remove a rock just to smell how it smells, to evaluate whether or not it's finished. And in the end, you get this one. So this was the eppa that was in the giviak that we followed. When you open it, it has this really tender red and sort of dry meat. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. But not everyone thinks so. So the giviak has become quite famous. And if you look at the narratives that exist around the giviak, you can come across something like this. If you Google it, you will find giviak, probably the world's most disgusting meat dish. Or this other example, I'm sorry, it's in Danish, but it's a Danish celebrity chef, Nikolaj Kirk, who went to northern Greenland, to Qaanaaq. And the story is basically how he ended up vomiting out the window of the house of the lady that served him the giviak, and how incredibly sick he got from eating it. And these are some stories that exist about giviak, but they don't really help us to understand why people make them. Why does giviak exist? Why are people still doing this? It's not because they want to be sick. It's not because they think it's fun that someone thinks it's disgusting. So these stories aren't really helping us understand the giviak, and that's something that we hope to change. When I was in northern Greenland, I had also the opportunity to experience this particular fermented food. It's a fermented eider egg. The eider is a different kind of seabird, and we went to Sjoapaluk, and someone brought us this egg because they knew we were interested in fermented foods, and we had an opportunity to taste it. And the flavor is amazing. For someone who really likes cheese, the flavors is amazing. It has, I mean, it's a Danish association, but for me, it tastes like the Danish cheese that we call gamle ole. It has a really strong cheese flavor. And they told us that you can collect those eggs one time a year. And that was a really interesting story to me. But the eider egg, to me at least, became much more than a story about fermented foods. For me, it became an entryway into starting to understand the concept of food sovereignty. Because when I went back home afterwards, I had a presentation back home in Inuk for the Greenland food cluster, where everyone interested in food in the capital area were assembled, and I was talking about this trip that I had, and I was talking about this egg and how incredible the flavor was. And there was a lady, a government official from the Fisheries and Hunting Department there, who raised her hand and she asked me, what bird was this? And this lady that I know quite well, she's very wise and knowledgeable, but she's also very stern. So when I said, oh, it's the eider, she just, oh, that's illegal. She responded to me that it's illegal to collect eider eggs. And the people there had told me that they could collect these eggs one day a year. So I was actually quite shocked when she said it, because I started worrying if I had put someone in danger by telling this story. But a lot of other things happened in my mind as well. It felt strange to me that this food that they make and they treasure so much, and they were so proud to show it, is illegal. Because some of the other things that we experienced in Northern Greenland was this, for instance, it's the kiwi fruit. So Siorapaluk is a town of about 50 or 60 people, and there's only one shop there. And in that shop, you have very few food items. And one of those food items is a kiwi fruit from Chile. I tried to put both Siorapaluk and Chile in a map here. And I had to zoom all the way out on Google Maps to be able to have both Chile and Siorapaluk there. So this sweet, fuzzy little fruit traveled all the way from Chile to Siorapaluk to be eaten there. But the birds that breed just outside of town and whose eggs have been fermented for hundreds of years, also according to historical literature, are actually illegal to make. And there's something there that just didn't sit well with me. So together with incredible colleagues that I have, Inge Siding, who's a historian, and Douglas Olsen, we looked into the history around our food sovereignty situation in Greenland based on some of the thoughts that I had after traveling there and realizing that eider eggs are illegal to collect. And one of the things that came up is that the argument against Inuit food sovereignty in Greenland is actually founded on some old ideas about Inuit, a narrative that still exists today, that Inuit are somehow inherently wasteful, that we are not able to manage our resources. And if we are allowed to, we will exploit our resources to extinction. And one of the pieces that was part of creating this narrative I've just brought here, it's a little long, but I hope you'll forgive me about that. I'm going to read it up. The masses of meat produced are immense, and it would seem that if all of it were dried, the Greenlanders could not by any means suffer want in winter. But this is unfortunately not the case. The Greenlanders, and especially the women, being too much children of the moment, they are often content with drying the smaller part of it and then let the remainder lie rotting. And this, in spite of the fact that they very last winter, they have perhaps been starving for want of provisions. Yes, it even happens so that they do not even care to cut open the seals in proper time so that both skin and meat lies and becomes rotten in the blazing sun. So this is an account by Müller from 1906. And if you remember the table that I showed in the beginning, the table listing fermented foods, what Müller is describing is actually an elaborate fermentation process, because whole seals, when you came across and you were so lucky to have more than the seals that you could bring back, you would leave them to ferment, and then you would come back for them later on the same year or the year after. And that has been described a number of times, but Müller didn't know this. And to him, Müller is a Danish government official who had a position in Greenland. To him, this is a rotting process. It's not a fermentation process. And in his mind, it's unimaginable that anyone will be eating these. So what was a fermentation, an elaborate fermentation, became a story about the wastefulness of the Inuit. And that's very interesting to me, that if we understand our fermented foods right, there are some of these narratives that we might be able to change. I want to show some other fermented foods as well. And there's a whole class of foods that might not by all be considered fermented, but I include them because they have a high microbial load. And those are foods in the class of gastrophagy, where you eat intestinal content or intestines. And this particular photo is narwhal intestine. And I really love this photo, sorry. What you can see, I hope that you can see that in the bottom, at the end of it, you can see that there's something flowing out there. So it has been rinsed, but there's still something inside. And once it's dried, it looks like what's shown here on the left side. That's when it's done and ready to be eaten. And when you open, so it's really dry on the outside and very hard. And when you open it up, you cut it open. It's really hard to cut open because it's really chewy. On the inside, it has this very sticky caramelly texture. And the flavor has no resemblance to caramel at all. It has an incredibly strong flavor that I mean, I don't know what I could compare it to. Fermented sea urchins, maybe, that I got in a sushi restaurant in Tokyo once. I mean, it's really a distinct flavor and very strong. And then there's the fermented content of the caribou stomach, something that I've spent some time looking into also microbially. I will not present the results here. You can refer to published papers on that. But I want to mention that this has been described as being the most treasured vegetable of the Inuit. So even our treasured vegetables are animal sourced. So we had this discussion in this dialogue series in the very beginning, where Professor Marco presented some of her work. What are really fermented foods? And the definition from the ISAP is that fermented foods are foods made through desired microbial growth and enzymatic conversions of food components. And I think this applies well to the foods that I've shown here today. But there's also part of that discussion that isn't in the definition, but is in the same statement. And that is discussion around how to distinguish between food spoilage and fermentation. And what it says is that the definition that I showed before is sufficiently broad to include not only fermentations, but also to distinguish between fermentation and food spoilage. And both processes occur via microbial growth and enzymatic activity, but spoilage is unintentional and fermentation is deliberate and controlled. So these foods, a lot of them that I've shown are, I would say they are deliberate, or they are sought out by human beings, but they are not controlled, and the processes are not controlled. For the Givia, there's some level of control in that you put the birds there, but it's the environment that actually controls the temperatures. And for the narwhal intestine, or for the stomach content of different animals, like the mussels out of the walrus stomach, these are definitely not controlled by human beings. But I think it's actually important to be able to embrace these kinds of foods in the definitions, because when we don't do that, then there can be misunderstandings. So I am going to show a piece of text, and it's a little bit long, and I hope that you'll forgive me for that. So you can read it yourself, or close your eyes and let me read it. Either way, I'm gonna read it out. So this is a professor, he was a professor for several years at the University of Greenland, a Danish professor in Greenland, who wrote that a serious complication was that salt, an absolute necessity, was available only in small quantities. And this had consequences for the conservation of meat. To a certain extent, it could be compensated culturally by declaring rotten meat as a delicacy and establishing the rotting process as a culinary factor. A great deal of half-rotten or more than half-rotten meat has been eaten in Greenland under the pretense that that was just how they liked it and how the real good old Greenlanders preferred it. However, this social masquerade could only be upheld within limits, for completely rotten meat was extremely dangerous and even lethal to swallow. So this piece of text by a person in power in Greenland completely illegitimizes Inuit perspectives of what fermented foods are and why they exist. And I feel that it's really important that we change some of these narratives. And I mean, it's not difficult to convince that these foods can be delicious. But just as an example, I want to also show this one, the iginal, that I also mentioned previously, which is fermented seal blubber made in a seal skin or a seal stomach or otherwise. And this is a southern Greenlandic dish in contrast to the Aviaja. And I had the incredible opportunity to bring some iginal to Alchemist, which is a Michelin star restaurant in Copenhagen. And I talked to the R&D lab there, and they think this is delicious enough. So we're actually working on both understanding this food better, but also doing some research around the flavors and how people from outside of Greenland perceive the flavors of the iginal, and hopefully also make a comparison to understand if people will perceive the flavors differently if they know that this is seal compared to if they do not know that this is seal. But I can just say iginal is delicious, and there's definitely no masquerade around that. So just to conclude, I want to say that what I find the most interesting about Inuit fermentation practice is that it depends on a trust and a collaboration with microbes that haven't been tamed. There's no control in Inuit fermentation processes. And I think that this can be an entryway to understand human relations to microbes in a very novel and interesting way. So this is what I talk about when I say that Inuit fermentation practice is relational, that it exists as an equitable relationship with the environment and with the microbes, not as a relation of control and dominance from human beings. It's also relational in the sense that you need to know someone who can make these foods to be able to even come across them, to be able to taste them or investigate them. So you need to have human relations to actually have the experience of Inuit fermentation. I also feel that Inuit fermentation practice has different aspects of being radical. In one sense, they're radical as they, to me, I understand them as sort of a root of fermentation because there's so little, they're not even artisanal, they're beyond that. They are examples of how fermentation can come to be, the early evolution of fermentation before it turns out into a very elaborate process that can be difficult to understand how it came to be. So that is one way that I understand Inuit fermentation practice as radical. Another way is that they are in such strong contrast to a lot of the fermented food that we often talk about in the Western world. So I feel that they serve us a lens through which we can see our own view of fermentation in a new way. They are this nice contrast to make us see what we assume as being fermentation, what we assume as being fermented foods. And that's another sense that I see them as being radical. So that's actually the end of my talk. And there are a lot of people that I want to thank. I've listed just some of them here. And as Stephanie said in the beginning, you can find out more about what we do on radicalfermentation.ucdavis.edu. You are always welcome to send me an email with any questions or comments at the University of Greenland. And I am on Instagram with under a green island. So thank you for giving me this space to talk.
Oh, thank you, Aviaja. I know we'll probably have any number of questions, but I want to start out by saying how grateful I am to be able to share this space with you. as Indigenous researchers, and some of the, and just to comment briefly on some of the things that excite me most about what I look forward to, and what our collaboratory gets up to. But I think that part of what, and also just as a fellow Arctic, subarctic person, part of what I think is sometimes hard to grasp for folks in the South, as we understand them, are these ideas of just what most people perceive as difference, right? Just a drastic difference, that the idea that a diet could be meat-based and not, the usual food pyramid that we've all been raised to believe is the way toward health, right, is completely unsettled when you actually take into account the radical Indigenous knowledges of folks above the 49th parallel in what we now call Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and also, including our Sami relations over in Europe, right, and Siberia. So this idea that what we don't know about the Arctic has a great potential to unsettle the ways we understand arts, humanities, and science education, as well as research. But also the idea of presence in terms of, I know you've been quoted recently in some interviews. I think it was the Fermentation Association critique of its current makeup in terms of usually considering community-based experts and even Indigenous researchers not as equal partners in the research process. And so I have kind of an opening question about presence in terms of not only when did you first know that microbiology was going to be your thing, it was going to be your field that you make interventions in, like what was maybe that moment, and then how have you understood your presence as an Inuk microbiologist to kind of change throughout your education and where you see yourself now? Because I'm very attuned to the assumed absence, that we're not here, that we aren't part of the conversation, but that what you're doing would seem radical in academia, but is not, in fact, when we're in the community. So the question being just, how did you know microbiology was for you? And then just how have you understood the importance of Indigenous presence in microbiology?
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, so there was a very specific moment for me. I always knew I wanted to be a biologist. I mean, I went for that, like really stubborn-headed since I was like 9-10 years old. Back then I wanted to work with elephants in Africa. So instead I turned to something very small in the Arctic. My grandmother lived in Africa at that time in Zambia. So there was a moment through my studies in biology, where I realized that there was a research group at the University of Copenhagen that worked exclusively with Greenlandic microbes. And I had at that time been living in Denmark probably for 15 years. And while I had the opportunity to come back to Greenland maybe every third year or so, it's really expensive to go to Greenland, I didn't feel very closely connected I was just a Danish person like anyone else with this extra thing. Oh yeah, I'm also from Greenland, but it wasn't actually a big part of my daily thinking. And then I discovered this research group and I thought, well, I like microbiology. I was really into biotechnology and they worked around biotechnology. And I thought, okay, I'll do my master's thesis there. And then this ball started rolling. And I think within a year or two, everything I did revolved around Greenland without exception. And that really became the start for me. I actually applied to this other master's degree that deals with humans and human physiology and human genetics. But I didn't know anyone working with Greenland there. It turned out later there was, and I collaborate with them on something else now. But like the choice of leaving that other master's program and going to my microbiology was because I could work with Greenland there. And yeah, the world of Greenland microbes just opened up to me. And I, for a long time, I think I was lucky through my studies, just thinking I was one of the others. I never had this feeling that I was an Indigenous person trying to become something like someone else. I was just Danish. I have those two sides inside me. So after that ball rolled and rolled and rolled and became really big, I had this feeling that I wanted to move back to Greenland, and that's what we did when I finished my PhD. I went for a postdoc and got a grant to go there. So I brought my husband and at that time 1 son, and we lived in Greenland for 3 years, where I was at the University of Greenland. And that also completely changed me from thinking from a STEM perspective all the time, thinking from a bioinformatics or microbiological perspective on my research all the time, to seeing how the things that I was working with was impacting the community, or things that I was working with had impacted a community 100 years ago because something had gone wrong. And being able to connect what I worked with in my daily life to society every day. It's been a tough process, just opening up to ideas about sovereignty, about indigeneity. It's a really tough process, but it's a good one. So now I'm here.
And do you feel that and because I don't know, I'm in the arts and humanities, are there many Indigenous or Inuit microbiologists, or do you feel like you're going to be the one bringing up the next generation? Or in terms of, like in music studies, for example, I know that there are kind of 2 generations before me of Native scholars with PhDs in music, right? Are you aware of any such kind of genealogies in microbiology?
No. I'm it right now. Well, there might be someone, and if there's someone out there feeling like overlooked, I would connect to me, please. I don't know anyone in microbiology or biotechnology.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other questions I want to ask before, because it looks like we have quite a few questions in the chat popping up, is this idea that in some of the readings that we've done together as a group, of course, one of the first introductions to fermentation for me was the Sandor Katz book that we all read together, which was The Fermentation as Metaphor, which I understand is not highly technical or highly scientific, but there is a moment in that book that talks about eating meat as a murderous event, or talking about the kill moment, which I know for a lot of Southerners, especially vegetarians and vegans, is why a lot of our Arctic and subarctic foodways are vilified, that they're seen as dangerous, wrong, unethical, all these things, right? And I've heard you speak in other interviews about Greenlandic perspectives about subsistence hunting and subsistence lifeways. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about just how you understand, or how folks that you work with in Greenland understand kind of the broader process of what's at stake in terms of souls and reciprocity and respect and all these things that are going on in the process of hunting and then to get to the fermentation.
So Greenland is in a stage where our daily lives are so influenced by colonization that we go to the grocery store and we shop our foods. You can't even get seal and whale in the grocery store sometimes. I don't think people take time to thank that seal or that whale in the supermarket when they go and buy it there. And usually they will go for that Danish pork meat because it's less expensive. So it's really not a part of daily lives today. And I feel that that's something that we need to change, and something that I hope will change with this kind of research, emphasizing the strengths of the foods that we have, because, and that's something I didn't touch upon at all, but besides just eating them and their potential microbial load that might or might not have an impact on us as human beings, there is the making of these foods that requires a whole family, that requires you to sweat. And when I talk about that in other interviews, I usually my family's traditions as an example, like hunting for caribou with my family means that you have to walk from Anguiatofik 15 kilometers, 15 kilometers uphill to Agustinguit. And this is where you shoot the caribou. Don't shoot it before, because that caribou did not eat from Agustinguit, and it needs to eat from there because it tastes better. And then you shoot it there. And we were 4 when I went hunting, and we had a caribou in a muskox, and I shot the muskox. So I wanted to carry that animal back. And the 4 of us then had a half an animal each. And muskoxes are quite big. So carrying that animal 15 kilometers back was insane. And in the village, or in the settlement that my Anna, my grandmother, is from, there's this, there used to be this rule that a child had to carry the first animal they shot, like in Anguiatofik. The first caribou a child shot, he or she had to carry that animal back home. And the reason that I'm telling all this is to say that you feel the weight of those resources on your shoulders. You are crying when you come back to camp because you are feeling that weight, and you have seen that animal die. It's not a pleasant experience. So these things with, when you eat, connecting that to a, I'm calling it resource, but that word, I'm not meaning resource, but connecting that to something that was living and that took something away from life is so important. And you can be a vegetarian or a vegan and have the same approach to life on Earth, but you can also be a vegetarian and a vegan and never consider all the steps that your soy paste went through, and who made that soy paste to begin with, and what resources it took out of the world. So I feel that we need to go back to a place where we are more immediately connected to the resources that we take out of this world.
And I think that that links to a question from the chat in terms of understanding that you're recalling the desired, the word desire in the definition of fermentation, right? Desired attributes, or you know, we meant to do this, or we wanted this to happen. It's a really interesting link with conversations we're having in Native American and Indigenous studies methods, where so much of how we've been framed and in our communities and our foodways and our practices and our knowledge systems and social systems as deficit-based, and that there's these negative feedback loops, which is what I think our collective is very interested in counteracting, right? And so this shift from what one of our Arctic relations Unanga scholar Eve Tuck talks about is shifting from damage-centered narratives to desire-based. And so I think it's really interesting that part of the desire too doesn't involve a need to control the environment. And so your use of words like uncontrolled and untamed has prompted some questions also in the chat here, in terms of Joshua Evans is asking if you would reflect on the idea of control and how it interacts with Inuit understandings of human, more than human, environmental kinds of relationalities. Just that idea of control, and how maybe you've had to even shift in your own thinking, as you were talking about in your experience in being back in Greenland for 3 years, of kind of what we know Bang and Medine calling Eurocentric ethnoscience to Inuit perspectives on science.
So I know my connection isn't too bad, and you also when the noise went out a little bit sometimes, but I hope I understood the question. And one thing that I think about in that context is that in our myths, we, like, one of the most important myths that we have is the one about the mother of the sea. And the mother of the sea, there's a long, we don't have time to go into it, unfortunately, but the essence is that if we do not treat the animals well, if we do not treat our environments well, if we do not adhere to our taboos and thank the animal or do what the animal requires of us, the mother of the sea will take back all our foods. And there's this, in that lies the fact that we are dependent on our environment. We are dependent on nature. And we are, so regardless of how much we try to control it, we are always still dependent on it. And I feel that that's something we need to bring forward, rather than thinking of how can we control the environment, and realizing that we are depending on it now and forever.
And that brings up a connection to a question that's also been asked in the chat about the difference in, and I don't know if you can answer this yet, or if this has been proven in the science you've been doing, or with Maria, in terms of, is there a documented difference between the microbes or the makeup of Inuit fermented foods versus industrial scale fermented meats, right? Like, is that part of what will be critical to undoing the to uplifting positive feedback loops on the benefits and the healthy narratives about Inuit fermented foods?
So I can't answer with the fermented foods from this talk, because I've actually just been told today the data is ready. But I did a study comparing dried fish, where one of the dried fish was actually also a fermented version, but a specific dried fish that we eat whole, including its stomach content, including its bones, including everything. And I compared different ways of drying that fish, and there's also one that you can buy in the store. And what we saw in that study was that the diversity of microbes on the industrially produced dried fish, same species, exactly same species, all from Greenland, compared to those that have been dried the traditional way in the environment, there's a much less diverse community of microbes on the industrial ones compared to those that are made in nature. So when we eat fermented foods, certainly, but also our dried foods in Greenland, because all of our foods are made in nature, we are eating microbes from nature. And there's certainly a difference between doing these things industrially compared to doing them the traditional way, also in the microbes.
I see that we're just about at time, and so I just wanted to say, kind of referencing or citing your previous podcast too, about that there's no simple answers for complex problems, right? That so much of what the world has to learn from Inuit foodways and Inuit fermentations, more specifically, are going to uplift a density of knowing and things that are practices and processes that are place-based, and that so much of what happens in colonization is a mapping over on top of bringing foodways and practices into places that they weren't developed there, right? So I think what's going to be exciting moving forward is continuing to kind of unravel the idea that universal solutions have any role to play in climate justice and food security and food sovereignty. And so I just want to say thank you again for sharing your research today, and I'm just really excited to seeing the next steps and where we all get to. So thank you, Aviaja.
Yeah, me too, and thank you. And thanks everyone who participated today. Thanks for the questions.
Yes, we will be in touch soon and answer questions that we weren't able to get to right away. But thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you all again soon.